Okay, so today the video is going to be on how to make a prop sword. This one is for my DEATHSTROKE costume. Some of this stuff is made out of odds and ends and pieces I had laying around. Most of it is all EVA foam, and you can do a much simpler build of this by just using a yardstick and putting a handle on it and then painting it metallic or covering it with metallic tape. But I really wanted to have a curved shape on this and some depth to it and some width. So yeah, I went ahead and started from scratch and made one from EVA foam. And hopefully this video will help you out in your cosplaying and costume needs. And thanks for watching. Okay, so for this build, you're going to need some sheets of 5mm foam. It's a tax about $1.40 a piece. I got a few sheets here, different colors. And I also have some scrap foam from a previous build I'm going to use as filler. I have a tube from a lightsaber. It was a blade builder's blade that I removed and put an Ultra Saber's medium blade on it. But you can use PVC pipe or whatever. You're going to need cutting tools like scissors, X-Acto knife, something to write with, some glue. For this I'm going to use super glue and some Gorilla Glue and some hot glue. I already got the hot glue gun plugged in. You're also going to need a dowel rod or something like that to provide support for the center of the blade. And the same technique I'm using for this, I used to make a Wonder Woman sword for my partner's Wonder Woman costume that she wore on Halloween. And I also used it to make the God Killer sword from the new 52 Deathstroke that nobody really seemed to like, but I liked it, so I made the sword. However, this is a little bit too big to attach to the back of the costume and hang on my back, so I'm making the Deathstroke sword. I'll be using the same technique for this, like I say, basically, that I used for this. It was just a larger scale, more detail, more work. But hopefully this will give you some ideas to make your own and do your own interpretation of it, or you could just follow the tutorial that I do here step by step. So you're going to notice some duct tape here on the center of my dowel rod. The reason for that is I cut it at a slight angle, flipped it around, and used some Gorilla Glue to put it back together. And I used the duct tape to help hold it in place. And the reason I did this is it gave a slight curvature to it instead of being straight. And if you happen to find a dowel rod that already has a slight curve, that'd be great too. This is going to be because I'm going to make a katana style blade, as you saw in the beginning. It's going to have a slight curve to it. And I want this to fit as evenly as possible down the center. Alright, I took some scissors and I just cut down the section right down the center of 2 pieces of the EVA foam. And then I took contact cement and put it on the edges of both. And now that I've let the contact cement sit, I'm going to push these two together so I have one long piece that'll be long enough for the dowel rod for me to cut out the blade. While I wait for those pieces to finish setting, I'm going to go ahead and start the handle, because first I'm going to attach the handle to the dowel, and then I'm going to do the handguard, and finally the blade. So to get this ready, I'm going to use a piece of scrap EVA foam. I'm going to take this and press it into the foam to give me impression to cut out with some scissors, and I'm going to use some super glue and glue that in the end to plug this bottom part. Yep, and I had plugged the end with the circle of EVA foam that I cut out. And I put a little hot glue in the bottom, and I put in some little scrap chopped up pieces of EVA foam. I'm going to put that in with some layers of hot glue, because I really only want the dowel to come about halfway down, and the rest of this is just going to be dead space. And this way I can have a little bit of weight from the hot glue, but not too heavy, because I'll be filling it with little chunks of EVA foam. Now that I've got this filled up to the height that I've wanted, I've put some hot glue on the top, and I'm going to go ahead and insert this dowel rod down and center it. Alright, I've inserted it in the center, and I've just kind of begun filling it in with hot glue. Letting it fill up so that when it cools, it will be nice and firm right there. Alright, there it is, all filled up with hot glue. And it's already starting to cool. You can see it's getting less translucent lower down. And once that cools, I'm going to move on to the handguard. So I was going to cut out a circular piece from the EVA foam, but I actually found the lid of an orange juice container, and I sanded off the raised lettering on it and cut a hole in it. I'm going to actually use that for the handguard. And I'm going to go ahead and put some glue on the bottom and go ahead and slide this on, attach it, and center it. Now that I've got all that put together, I'm going to start drawing and measuring out my blade that is going to cover this dowel rod. Okay, so next I took the two pieces that I glued earlier and I drew along the natural curve of the dowel, extending the tip out because I don't want the tip to have the dowel rod in it. I want that to be flexible if need be to avoid any sort of accidental injury. And I'm going to cut with an X-Acto knife or a razor blade, whatever you want to call it. I'm going to cut along this curvature edge. I'm not going to cut it straight. I'm going to cut it at a 45-degree angle, give it the illusion of an edge. The backside here I am going to cut straight. And then once I cut this out, I'm going to flip it over onto the blue piece, and I'm going to trace it and cut it the same way, and then get it prepped to glue both pieces together. Alright, I cut out both pieces, and see I cut on a 45-degree angle here so that when it matches up it'll have a blade-like appearance. And I've already started to heat the edges and smooth them out. And next what I'm going to do is I'm going to heat these insides here and put a curve down the length of it so that the wooden dowel can fit in it once both sides are glued together. Alright, I went through and put the curvature in both blades, and I've marked where the dowel rod's going to stop. And I'm going to use some contact cement to glue these two tip pieces together, but no further than this line. Part of the reason for this is contact cement is kind of a one and done thing. If you don't get it lined up perfectly, it doesn't work. So I'm not too worried about lining up the tip here and gluing it. But for the rest of the way down the dowel rod, I'm going to use super glue and maybe some hot glue to help secure all that in place. Right, I've glued the two end pieces here together, and if there's a little overlap, they're not quite flush, don't worry, because we are going to be sanding all this down and using silicone on places like this seam here and the seam on the back side and the front, and repeated applications of the DAP silicone with latex acrylic is going to help hide and cover and conceal all of the seams and all of the marks. So you'll have a nice looking product. And now that this is glued together on the end, I'm going to insert the dowel rod down the length of it, figure out where I want it, glue it in place, and I'm going to start gluing the edges on both sides together using super glue. Alright, so I ran a bead of super glue along the inside of each one of these pieces and positioned the dowel rod in place the way that I wanted it, and match these both up so they'd be as straight as even as possible. And the next thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to begin gluing these edges here together gradually, and I'm going to do that using some more super glue. Okay, I've gone ahead and glued the back side of it together, and now I'm going to go through and I'm going to finish the front. Alright, so I've glued both sides, the front and the back side, and you'll notice the edges here are kind of shiny on both sides, and the reason for that is I applied a generous amount of super glue and then I brushed it out evenly. And the reason I do this is the EVA foam is porous and it absorbs this, and it makes it stiff and rather hard on the edges. And then from there, I feel it makes it a lot easier to sand once this super glue fully dries. It gives you a nice firm surface to get a good even sand. I've had tearing and a lot of other issues with sanding on the EVA foam. Move on to sanding the edge and the backside. And I'm going to start off with some rough grit. And once I get the initial shaping done, I'm going to move on and use some 320 grit to smooth it all out. Okay, so here's what I was talking about. When you sand on it, it ends up kind of tearing it up. So what I do in between layers of sanding is I heat this, which causes it to shrink up and I can sand it smoother again. Now I'm still using the heavy grit sandpaper as I work this down. I have not moved on to the finer grit sandpaper yet. So yeah, and the easiest way to heat these edges is to use a heat gun. You always want to be careful you don't get it too hot because you may melt the foam. People have told me that they use hair dryers. I imagine that would work probably on high, but it'd probably take a lot longer and be much slower than just using a high output heat gun. Alright, so I finished sanding and shaping this, and then I also went through and heated it pretty thoroughly so that seals everything up before I do the Mod Podging on it. However, that's not the next step I'm going to move on to. Next, I'm going to move on to the handle here, where I'm going to wrap this up, and I'm also going to make a little pommel end piece that's going to come off of it. And I'd say total took me about an hour and a half worth of sanding to get this the way I wanted it to look. And the cleaner your cuts are, the less time you're gonna have to spend sanding. I had to spend so much time sanding because I didn't do a very good job. Honestly, I'm not gonna lie about that. I didn't do the greatest job with my cuts with the razor blade. So yeah, I just spent a lot of time smoothing all this out. Okay, so I have an extra leftover scrap piece of the 5mm thick foam. And what I'm going to do here is I'm going to take a straight edge. In this case, it's going to be a ruler. And I'm going to take this X-Acto knife. And I just put it out a little bit from closed, because I don't want to cut all the way through the foam. I'm going to give it about a 2mm cut on an angle running this way. I'm going to do these cuts about every 1/4 of an inch or so. And once that's done, I'm going to go back in the opposite direction, and I'm basically going to score the film about 2mm deep. And when you curl it around the handle and heat it, all those little checker marks are going to open up, and it's going to look like a textured diamond handle. Okay, so I've gone through and done my diagonal cuts at about 2mm deep, and now I'm going to go back and do them in the opposite direction. Okay, I've made the cuts in both directions, and whenever I roll this up, you can see you get this sort of like diamond pattern. Looks pretty cool. And I did do this a little bit bigger than what I'm actually going to need, and the reason is I've come to find when I do stuff like this, the hardest parts are right here at the beginning. As you can see, I got a cut right there off, and there's a couple more down here, and right at the end, and that's where I get a lot of wiggly lines and whatever. So I do it a little bit bigger so I can trim out the pieces that I need. And I'm actually going to measure this around the handle here, and I'm going to do 2 pieces that are going to separate with a little gap here, and I'm going to run an orange piece through. There you can see both pieces have been trimmed and attached to the tube of the handle with some super glue. And I also heated the foam, and that caused it to expand a little bit more and bring out the definition from the cuts. And next I'm going to measure and cut some strips of 3mm EVA foam to fill in this gap here. I went ahead and cut the strip of 3mm EVA foam and laid it across here so it'll have kind of a flat piece on the side. I think later I'm going to go through with some 2mm foam and put a little raised edge through the center. That will be painted the same orange as my Deathstroke mask. And here on the end, I just found this rubber stopper piece. I have no idea what it's from. You could just cut a circle of EVA foam. But yeah, I just took that and glued it to the end of the handle, to give it a pommel. And it's pretty straight and even and balanced and stands up on its own. And so far it doesn't look too bad. I'm pretty excited with it. So next, what I'm going to do is put a little raised piece over this, very similar to what is on the katana. Okay, and the final piece for the pommel, I found a knob lying around. Sorry, I don't know where you buy these. It's just a cheap plastic knob, and I took and sanded it down so it comes to a point here. And then I'm going to attach that on the end here. And glue it right in the center on there. So it has kind of this sharp little stabby thingy. Alright, so this has been glued on. Once I super glued it on, I sealed it off around the edge with some hot glue. Right in there. And then I took the hot tip of the glue gun and smoothed it out so it angles nicely onto it instead of having that lip. Okay, so I took a piece of paper and I approximated the distance around this and I drew out a pattern. And I took a piece of 3mm foam and drew the pattern on it and cut it out. And this is the finished result that is going to end up gluing on like this. And there it is, all glued on. So now that I've got all of the main pieces glued together, before I Mod Podge it and paint it, I'm going to do some silicone work to hide some seams. And what I use is actually a silicone. It's an acrylic silicone with latex, and it's from a company called DAP. It comes in a tube and goes in a caulking gun and runs for about $3, $4, maybe $5 at Lowe's or Home Depot. I take all mine and I use the gun and I squirt it all out of a tube into a Tupperware and I just save it. Otherwise it ends up drying out in the tube. And I also have a little container here of water. I've gone through this in some of my other videos, but if you haven't seen that and aren't familiar with this, I'm going to show you what I do. I take a little bit of the silicone, then any area, like right here, there's a very slight seam. What I'm going to do is I'm going to smear this across. Okay, and I apply a decent amount of pressure because I want this to get into the seam itself, into the crack. And I know what you're thinking, this looks like crap, and it does. And that is what the water here is for. Clean all the excess silicone off my finger, dip it in the water, get it wet, and then alright, let that dry for a few minutes, and you can see it smoothed out pretty good. And I'm probably going to do another layer or so of this once this dries. I have to let this initial layer dry first. But right here on this edge, I'm going to need a little bit more silicone in there. And any area like that on this, I'm going to repeat the same process. And once it's done, I can further remove any imperfections by gently sanding this with some 600 grit sandpaper. And some of the other areas I'm going to apply the silicone to are this underside right here. I'm going to apply some here around this edge so I can remove some of those blemishes, and here on this tip. And I'll show you what it all looks like whenever it's all siliconed and sanded. Okay, kind of went a little silicone crazy, but I ended up doing the edge all the way to the tip, the seams on both sides, and also did the back side of it, along with the underside of the scabbard here, or sorry, not the scabbard, but the handguard, and the pommel. Alright, I went ahead and did a second layer of the silicone, and in between each application I usually give it about at least 6 hours to fully dry and set, and a lot of times I'll just wait 24 hours. And next what I'm going to do is take some very fine 600 grit sandpaper, and I'm going to very carefully buff out some of these areas where I applied the silicone. And I don't go too fast, and I don't press too hard. You can tear and peel off the silicone, so I just go slow and even and take my time and do the best I can to smooth it all out. Alright, I finished all my sanding. So now I'm going to begin to seal the foam, and what I'm going to use for this first part is some Mod Podge. I'm also going to plastic dip it, but in order to save, the plastic dip is rather expensive, so in order to save money on it, I'm going to use some Mod Podge first, and this will also help give it a texture. I'm going to do the brush strokes in this direction, and I'm going to coat everything from this piece down to the end here, and I'm going to mask this off, and I'm only going to plastic dip this part. The blade part of it is just going to be the Mod Podge, because I want to have a nice texture, and I really don't want any of the plastic to thin that out. Alright, I took some masking tape and a grocery bag, and I masked off the blade, and now it's ready for me to plastic dip this part here. Alright, I went ahead and plastic dipped this and let it sit for about 14 hours. And now I'm going to go ahead, before I take the masking off, I'm going to spray it with some Rust-Oleum flat protective enamel. Now initially I had decided to use a semi-gloss, but I figure if I don't like the flat black, I can always clear coat it, and that'll give it a nice gloss sheen. Okay, so I cannot stress enough how important it is to wear eye protection and protection for your respiratory system. I always wear a mask of some sort. I don't buy the cheap ones. I always do something decent. Because whether it's plastic dip or spray paint or clear coat or anything, it's really bad for your lungs and your sinuses. And here is the finished product so far after doing the matte black spray paint. Like the way it catches the light, like the way it looks. And this side here that's wider is the side that fits in my palm, and this side is where my fingers grip. The palm side, I'm going to put a strip running right down the center here. It's going to be orange. I'm not going to do that until the end. And next, once this is fully dry, I'm going to strip off this masking, and I'm going to Mod Podge the blade. Alright, I went ahead and removed the masking. And now I'm going to take some Mod Podge and I'm going to start brushing it over the length of the blade. And all the brush strokes are going to be in this direction. I'm going to coat both sides, and then I'm going to repeat this process for a total of 2 lengthways coats. There it is. You can see I put a nice thick coat on it with all the brush strokes going lengthways. Alright, so I finished both vertical coats of Mod Podge on the length of the blade. And the final thing I'm doing with the Mod Podge, you can see here on the edge, I kind of did this thick wavy layer here that runs all along the edge of it. And this is to give it a texture for the temper line. On katanas, they have the back sides of the blade are softer and the front sides of the blade are heat treated to be harder, so they hold a razor sharp edge. And the softness of the back side is to help absorb the shock from cutting or slap paring away a sword. And they have a wavy pattern called the Hammond that goes down the length of the blade, and that's from the tempering and heat treating process that is unique to the katana. And this is kind of a cross between a katana and a scimitar in a sense with the curved tip, but I still wanted to give it that tempered look. So I just kind of gobbed it on pretty quick here and then did a nice long single wavy brush up the length of it. And when this dries, you'll see the texture difference. And once this dries, you can see I've already masked all this off with some saran wrap and some masking tape. I'm going to go ahead and primer this gray, and I'll move on to the following steps of hand painting over the gray primer. All right, now that everything's dry, I'm going to take some gloss gray, and this is from Valspar. It's their Project Perfect Paint Plus Primer. I'm going to use this to prime the blade, and same as with the Plastidip, you should always wear some sort of respirator and eye protection. I like this Valspar and I like the Rust-Oleum because it goes on nice and even. Gives it a good clean coat. Right, the gray paint here is dried. And you can see the Hammond line I put there in juxtaposition with the straight brush strokes and the difference in texture. And part of the other reason I did this whole line here, this curved temper line, is because it'll provide a natural guide mark for I'm going to paint with what. And some of the paints I'm going to use, I've got some silver, a couple bottles of that. I have this stuff I've had for a long time. It's platinum. I haven't been able to find it when I've been looking for it, but it is a much lighter, more chrome colored. And I usually end up using the platinum for wear and tear and weathering. And I also have some gunmetal gray. And I also have spiced pumpkin, which is an orange that I used for the Deathstroke costume. I have this piece of EVA foam here, 3mm thick. I already painted it a while ago so that I would have a nice consistent color. I've just been kind of hacking pieces off it as I made pouches and different things for the Deathstroke costume. So I have this extra piece. I'm going to cut a strip out of it that's going to run up and down the center of the handle here on my palm side. Okay, so what I'm starting off with is the gunmetal gray. Just blob some out here. And I'm going to take this brush, which is not quite as light as the blade, and I'm going to brush this up and down the length of it on both sides. And that's going to be my first coat, the first metallic that I'm going to put down. Okay, so I brushed it up and down the length of the blade, and I didn't try 100% to avoid getting it here on the squiggly temper line, but I didn't paint it all the way up to the edge. This gunmetal gray is metallic, it's a little darker, and I'm putting that down first before I move on to the silver, because basically what I'm going to do is this backside here and the back of the blade itself, I'm going to coat in a total of 2 layers of the gunmetal gray. This is only the first layer. I'm going to avoid the temper line that I put in here with the Mod Podge, because what I'm going to do is, once I do this, I'm going to layer silver over it. And I want there to be somewhat of a contrast between this and the temper line. The temper line is going to be just the silver on top of the primer gray. And the very edge itself, that would be the cutting edge, is going to be just the platinum, which is the lightest of the 3. Alright, so I did the 2 coats of the gunmetal gray. And you can see the contrast here between the gray primer and the gunmetal. The gunmetal is pretty dark. It isn't fully covered and fully thickened, it doesn't matter. I just wanted this as a dark base to add some contrast, because next I'm going to use the silver and I'm going to brush it over this. Now these particular brand of acrylic craft paints that I use, they tend to not be, they don't apply very thick. You have to really do a lot of coats to get it to build up. And I want a contrast between this and the temper line and the edge. So that's why I did the dark layer first. And I'm going to do my first coat and see how it looks when it dries. And I'm going to coat the whole thing, especially the edge, and see how that looks after the first coat, and then I'll go from there. Okay, I've got the blade pretty much painted up here. I'm going to have to do a little bit of touch up there, but overall it looks pretty good. Now all I have to do is I'm going to run some of this platinum right down the center here to distinguish the edge from the temper line and the rest of the blade. And glued my orange strip on and finished up this. I am going to do some weathering with some dry brushing and some silver paint on this, but I'm actually going to do that as a separate video, as a reference point for anything that I make, just to make the video a little bit shorter. I'm going to do the basic paint job, and then any weathering or anything like that I'll just go and do separately. I'm not going to feature it, but I'm going to do, like I say, a separate video where I do a little weathering and dry brushing on this, and I'll demonstrate that technique and what exactly I do, and hopefully this was helpful, and I hope that you enjoyed the video, and thanks for watching.